When you hear the word medieval, what comes to mind? Castles, knights, witches, and endless plagues? But what if I told you that most of what we believe about the Middle Ages is wrong? In this video, we're going to separate fact from fiction, uncovering the hidden truths and the dark secrets of medieval life. By the end, you'll see the so-called Dark Ages in a completely different light. The problem is that people still believe misleading myths about the medieval era, like flat Earth, torture chambers everywhere, no progress, only darkness. This video solves it by exposing the real history behind those myths. When we think about the medieval world, the first images that often come to mind are grim. People usually imagine a filthy, disease-ridden society where peasants lived in endless misery, knights spent their time swinging swords, and the church suppressed every bit of knowledge. The phrase Dark Ages itself suggests a time of ignorance, violence, and stagnation. But what if I told you that much of this picture is a myth carefully shaped by centuries of exaggeration, misunderstanding, and even propaganda? Tonight, we're going to peel back that layer of myth and discover what medieval life was really like. Let us start with one of the most common myths, the idea that people in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was flat. You've probably heard this in school or seen it referenced in pop culture, but the truth is, educated people in medieval Europe knew the Earth was round. This knowledge wasn't lost after the fall of Rome. In fact, medieval scholars used writings from ancient thinkers like Aristotle to understand the shape of our world. Sailors, merchants, and map makers all worked with the assumption that the Earth was a sphere. The flat Earth idea is actually a much later invention, popularized in the 19th century, and then pushed back onto the Middle Ages as if people back then were foolish. So right away, we can see how an entire era has been unfairly judged through a modern lens. Another powerful myth is that medieval people had no concept of hygiene, that they never bathed and lived in constant filth. It's true that medieval towns often struggled with waste disposal, and disease spread rapidly because of close living quarters. But does that mean they were ignorant of cleanliness? Not at all. Public bathhouses were common in many European cities well into the late Middle Ages. Wealthy nobles and even peasants enjoyed bathing, sometimes in communal spaces. Soap was produced from animal fats and ash, and written records show people actually valued smelling pleasant. What really happened was that during the Black Death and later plagues, bathhouses were sometimes shut down due to fears of infection. And over time, the stereotype of the dirty medieval peasant took hold. But daily washing of hands, faces, and even clothing was far more common than most of us have been led to believe. And what about the belief that life in the Middle Ages was nothing but constant war and violence? While knights and battles make for exciting stories, the truth is that most people never saw the battlefield. The majority of the population were peasants working the land, raising families, and engaging in community life. Feudal lords certainly clashed in brutal wars, and there were bloody events like the Crusades, but these were not everyday experiences for most medieval men and women. To think of the entire era as an endless battlefield is to mistake the dramatic for the ordinary. One of the darker myths we often hear is that the church crushed all forms of knowledge and kept people in the shadows of ignorance. The reality is more complex. The medieval church was certainly powerful and sometimes repressive, but it was also one of the main institutions preserving knowledge. Monasteries housed libraries where monks copied ancient texts by hand. Universities were born during the Middle Ages in places like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Scholastic thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus explored philosophy, theology, and even science. The medieval worldview was religious, yes, but it was also curious and innovative. Without this era, the Renaissance, the so-called rebirth of knowledge, might never have been possible. Even in medicine, where it's tempting to laugh at leeches and bloodletting, we find surprising levels of sophistication. Medieval physicians studied works from the Islamic world and ancient Greece, and hospitals were founded across Europe with systems of care that influenced modern medicine. Sure, not everything they did was effective by today's standards, but to call them ignorant or barbaric is unfair. They were working with the best tools and knowledge available to them, and they were often far more advanced than the myths suggest. Finally, let's address the idea that medieval people were simply less intelligent. less imaginative, or somehow fundamentally different from us. This is perhaps the biggest myth of all. The Middle Ages produced extraordinary art, from the stained glass of Gothic cathedrals to illuminated manuscripts that still shine with gold leaf today. They gave us epics like Dante's Divine Comedy, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and countless legends of Arthur and his knights. Their music, though different from ours, was complex and deeply tied to culture and spirituality. If anything, the creativity of the medieval world shows us that human imagination never went dark. It simply expressed itself in different ways. So why do these myths persist? The answer lies in history itself. After the Middle Ages ended, Renaissance scholars wanted to make their own time period look brighter and more advanced. One way to do that was by casting the centuries before them as dark, backward, and ignorant. Later, during the Enlightenment, writers doubled down on this narrative, portraying the medieval church as the enemy of science and reason. Over time, these ideas stuck, and by the 19th and 20th centuries, the Dark Ages myth was fully cemented in popular culture. But as we peel away those layers, we discover that the Middle Ages were not simply dark or light. They were complex, dynamic, and full of contradictions. They had their horrors, yes, but also their triumphs. And if we only see the myths, we miss the reality of a world that shaped the foundations of our own. When most people hear the words Middle Ages, they often picture a stagnant world where nothing new was discovered, nothing meaningful was invented, and human progress came to a grinding halt. It is as if the medieval centuries were a long, dark pause between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. But the truth is far more fascinating. The medieval era was not a period of stillness. It was a time of profound growth, experimentation, and innovation. Hidden beneath the shadow of the myths, the Middle Ages laid the foundation for much of the modern world we live in today. Let's begin with architecture. When we step into a Gothic cathedral like Notre Dame in Paris or Chartres in France, we are not looking at the product of ignorance or stagnation. We are witnessing the results of extraordinary engineering brilliance. Medieval builders mastered the use of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, innovations that allowed walls to rise higher and windows to expand larger than ever before. The stained glass windows were more than decorations. They were visual storytelling devices, teaching entire biblical narratives to a mostly illiterate population through radiant light and color. These cathedrals were constructed not only with faith, but with precise knowledge of geometry, physics, and craftsmanship that still astonish modern engineers. The Middle Ages were not a time of architectural darkness, but of architectural revolution. Advancements were not limited to buildings. The medieval period saw major developments in agriculture that transformed society. Before, farming was inefficient and backbreaking, but medieval farmers introduced the heavy plow, crop rotation systems, and the widespread use of the horse collar, which allowed horses to replace oxen for plowing. These seemingly simple innovations tripled agricultural productivity, which in turn supported population growth, the rise of towns, and the growth of trade. Far from being stuck in primitive ways, medieval people found practical solutions to feed millions and support the expansion of entire economies. And then there is science. Contrary to the myth of a world hostile to knowledge, the Middle Ages were alive with scientific curiosity. Astronomy, for example, was not ignored. Medieval scholars carefully studied the skies, preserving and expanding upon Greek and Arabic knowledge. In fact, the astrolabe, an instrument used to measure the positions of stars, was widely used in Europe, thanks to medieval exchanges with the Islamic world. Mathematics, too, advanced during this time. The adoption of Arabic numerals, including the number 0, revolutionized calculation and bookkeeping, paving the way for modern commerce and science. Medicine, often ridiculed for its superstitions, also saw important progress. Medieval hospitals were not merely places where people were left to die. They were organized institutions designed to care for the sick, provide shelter, and offer healing through both faith and practical remedies. Medical texts translated from Arabic sources introduced Europe to groundbreaking ideas in anatomy and pharmacology. Surgeons like Guy de Chebelic wrote detailed surgical manuals that influenced medicine for centuries. Yes, bloodletting and humors were still part of the medical framework, but alongside them came experimentation, observation, and the slow birth of empirical science. Education, too, flourished in ways often overlooked. The medieval university system, founded in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, became one of the most enduring contributions of the era. Students studied the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. It was a rigorous and structured system, and although deeply tied to theology, it encouraged debate, questioning, and logic. These institutions were the seeds that grew into modern universities, and the methods they use continue to shape how education works even today. Trade and exploration also expanded dramatically during the Middle Ages. Medieval merchants traveled vast distances, connecting Europe to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Through these networks came spices, silks, and new ideas. The Silk Road and Mediterranean trade routes were buzzing with activity, and the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe tied together dozens of cities in a powerful commercial alliance. This economic vibrancy challenges the idea of isolation. Instead, it reveals a Europe deeply connected to the wider world, exchanging knowledge, goods, and culture on a grand scale. And let's not forget the cultural innovations that flourished in this so-called dark time. Literature blossomed in the medieval world, not just in Latin but in vernacular languages. This was the age of Dante's Divine Comedy, a masterpiece of vision and poetry that mapped the medieval imagination of heaven and hell. It was the time of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which captured the humor, struggles, and personalities of everyday people in England. Across Europe, stories of King Arthur, the Song of Roland, and the legends of Robin Hood spread, showing us a society rich in storytelling and myth-making. These were not signs of cultural stagnation, but of vibrant artistic expression. Music, too, played a powerful role. Gregorian chant echoed in monasteries, while troubadours sang songs of love and adventure across the courts of Europe. Slowly, music grew more complex, developing harmony, notation systems, and eventually polyphony, setting the stage for the later explosion of Renaissance and Baroque music. Again, far from silence or simplicity, the medieval soundscape was full of innovation and evolving artistry. Technology should not be overlooked either. This was the age that introduced mechanical clocks, eyeglasses, windmills, and improved ship designs. The stirrup transformed cavalry warfare, and advancements in metallurgy allowed for stronger weapons and armor. Even everyday life changed dramatically with new tools and techniques that made tasks more efficient. Each of these innovations chipped away at the myth of a stagnant society and revealed a world constantly in motion, constantly experimenting, constantly building. When we put all of these truths together, a different picture of the Middle Ages emerges. It was not an era of unbroken ignorance, but a time of adaptation, connection, and invention. It may not have been a golden age of perfection, but it was certainly not the lifeless void we have been led to imagine. When we talk about the medieval world, it's easy to focus on knights in shining armor, kings ruling vast kingdoms, or the grandeur of towering castles. But beneath those romanticized images lies a shadowy side of medieval life, a side filled with strange superstitions, harsh punishments, and daily struggles that reveal just how different and yet strangely familiar this world was to ours. To understand the true Middle Ages, we have to step into those darker corners, because it is there that the realities of life reveal themselves most clearly. One of the most haunting realities of medieval life was the ever-present shadow of disease. The most infamous of all was, of course, the Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century. This plague wiped out nearly a third of the population, and its devastation left deep scars on the medieval psyche. People didn't understand germs the way we do today. So many explanations were rooted in fear, religion, and superstition. Some believed it was God's punishment, while others blamed poisoned wells or the alignment of the planets. Entire communities turned against outsiders, and tragically, Jews were often scapegoated, accused of spreading the plague. This darkness wasn't just the disease itself, it was the way fear transformed people, showing the fragility of social order when faced with overwhelming terror. But disease wasn't the only shadow hanging over medieval life. Justice, too, had a darker edge. Trials by ordeal were a common way to decide guilt or innocence. Imagine being accused of a crime and then told you must plunge your hand into boiling water or carry a red-hot iron. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were considered innocent. If they festered, you were guilty. In other cases, people were tied and thrown into water. Floating was seen as proof of guilt, while sinking meant innocence, though, of course, drowning could come first. These practices seem horrifying today, but they reveal the medieval belief that divine judgment would always reveal the truth. Justice was as much a matter of faith as it was of law. Superstition also shaped daily life in ways both strange and chilling. The medieval world was filled with beliefs in witches, spirits, and curses. People carried charms to ward off evil, and villages whispered stories of dark forces lurking in the woods at night. Astrology was taken seriously, and even kings consulted astrologers before making big decisions. Medicine was often mixed with magic, as herbs were prescribed alongside prayers and rituals. While some of these practices may sound foolish now, they offered people comfort in a world full of uncertainty, where science had not yet provided all the answers. Punishments for crimes could be shockingly brutal by our standards. Execution was not uncommon, and methods were designed not just to kill, but to send a message. Beheadings, hangings, and burnings at the stake were public events, drawing large crowds. In some cases, torture was used to extract confessions, with devices like the rack or the Iron Maiden becoming infamous symbols of medieval cruelty, though historians debate how widely some of these were actually used. The spectacle of punishment was a grim reminder that order had to be maintained through fear as much as through law. Even daily survival was marked by hardship. Most peasants lived in small, smoky houses with dirt floors, working long hours in the fields just to scrape by. Winters could be brutal, and a bad harvest meant hunger or even famine. Life expectancy was far shorter than today, with many children never reaching adulthood. And yet, within this darkness, people found ways to celebrate through festivals, music, and faith. Their resilience was as much a part of their reality as the struggles they endured. One of the darker secrets of the Middle Ages lies in the treatment of those considered outsiders. Lepers, for example, were forced to live in isolation, often in colonies outside the city walls. They were feared not just for their disease, but for the stigma attached to it, and many were treated more like criminals than patients. Women, too, often lived under harsh restrictions, their roles confined and their freedoms limited, though some queens, abbesses, and noble women found ways to exert power within the system. The reality of medieval society was full of inequality, where one's birth could determine the entire course of life. Warfare also carried its own grim truths. While knights and castles dominate our imagination, the reality was that war often meant devastation for ordinary people. Armies marched across the countryside, seizing food, burning villages, and leaving destruction in their wake. Sieges could last months, with both sides suffering starvation and disease. For the common man or woman, the glory of chivalry was little more than a distant story, while the reality was terror, hunger, and loss. And then there were the shadows cast by religion. The medieval church was a central force in everyday life, providing hope, community, and structure. But it also wielded immense power, and sometimes that power was used to silence or control. The fear of heresy led to trials and executions, while those who challenged authority risked their lives. Pilgrimages, relics, and indulgences offered spiritual comfort but also fed into systems of exploitation. Faith was genuine, but the darker side of devotion was the way it could be manipulated for power. All of these realities paint a more complicated picture of the medieval world than the myths suggest. It was not just an age of knights and castles, nor simply a time of ignorance. It was a world shaped by fear and faith, by hardship and hope, by cruelty and resilience. To see the Middle Ages clearly, we must look at both the light and the shadows. And it is in those shadows that we often find the most revealing truths about how people really lived. As we step back from the myths, the truths, and the darker realities of the Middle Ages, a far more nuanced picture begins to emerge. The so-called Dark Ages were never truly dark. They were a time of contrast and era where faith and superstition guided people's choices, yet innovation and curiosity pushed society forward. They were centuries marked by hardship and disease, but also by resilience, creativity, and the slow building of the foundations that would shape the modern world. The myths of ignorance and stagnation hide the reality of brilliant cathedrals reaching toward the heavens, of scholars preserving and expanding ancient knowledge, of farmers and craftsmen reshaping the way people lived. At the same time, the shadows of plague, fear, and brutal justice remind us that life in the Middle Ages was fragile, unpredictable, and often harsh. What makes this period so captivating is the way it mirrors the complexity of human nature itself, capable of cruelty and compassion, bound by fear, yet driven by hope, clinging to old beliefs while daring to imagine new possibilities. To see the Middle Ages only as dark is to miss their light, and to see them only as enlightened is to ignore their shadows. The truth lies in the balance, in the tension between myth and reality, and in the human struggle that connects their world to ours.